This is A Shattered Piece by GABRIEL TESONE. I like the song, the first sentence, it's very strong. And I'd read more. And then next we have this part here. She was a girl listening to her grandmother's tales. So this would be more important later. But with this line, the image that I have of Martha right now is that she's a young girl. Well, spoiler alert, she's actually a grandmother herself during this part of the story. So far, I really think that this story is very well written. And I also like pointing out things that I really like, the lines that I think really stand out to me as a reader. So this part, Martha listened, the forest held its breath. Okay, so this is the part where I got confused because it says here Tomar is actually the grandson of Martha. So when I got to this part, I actually had to reread the first few passages. So this is my comment. Was confused and surprised that Martha is actually old. There's a lot of things happening during this part, right? The focus here is actually on Martha, but I would wonder, what about the other villagers? So Martha is very clearly in a panic. But how about the others? The image we have here is a very anxious Martha. But the others are not moving. And not in a frozen in fear kind of way. So I'd like to read more details about what is happening in the mayhem of the village. Because given that it is a village, so there's going to be a lot of people, basically a tight-knit community, and their home is being invaded. So what must they be feeling? And I would also like to point out here, light the signal fire. Consider adding a phrase where this is addressed into the general crowd of mayhem. Because if you notice here, there's a lot of direction from Martha, right? So bar the doors to the nearest cottager, light the signal fire, and then she also gives instruction to Elena. So it can become confusing because as the reader, we might not exactly know who Martha is speaking to. That's why I would like to point out for these instructions to be separated. I did mention in my letter to the author that I appreciate the fact of trying to evoke the sense of confusion that the villagers do have with all of these things happening at once. I think that it's a good thing to employ in your writing, but at the same time, there should also be a balance with that so that the reader isn't confused to the point that it takes them out of the story. And Elena is actually going to be an important part of the story because the second half of the first chapter actually focuses on her. And when it did shift to that point of view, I was confused because I actually forgot who Elena was. I did have to go back to find where she was first mentioned. So her first mention is in this passage. So I would ask, aside from her being swift-footed, I assume that's why Martha asked her specifically to be the one to run to last wall. So aside from that swift-footedness about her, what else is important about her? So consider adding more noteworthy information so that we can remember her later, since the last few pages focus on her, which means she's an important character. I really like this line. The use of old herb and the part about his hands trembling more from adrenaline than age. Very nice details. The part that I mentioned here about being confusing. Two instructions said right after the other and happens again in this paragraph. Barricade with the wood piles and the old cart, and then it directly switches to instructions specifically given to Aaron and his two boys. So I would say consider distinguishing who these instructions are being given to. See earlier comment. Okay, so here I would ask, how else can you describe this place apart from its architecture? What is its significance? I really like this part. It also gives a good background into the kind of community, the kind of people who are living in this village. So nicely written. And I especially like the use of the word souls. So I actually have a question about this part. When did it actually start? There was only a low guttural sound, not specifically chanting, that followed clanging earlier. So I'd also like to point these kind of things out so that we can check for continuity throughout the story. I also have some additional questions here. Consider describing where he's positioned. Where is his vantage point? What does it look like? This was actually mentioned just 3 paragraphs ago here. So I would say consider changing this because it was just used a few paragraphs ago. I was actually also surprised here. Marta did grab a pitchfork. It's implied that she's going to fight, right? But isn't she a grandmother? So here I would add a comment. Consider adding a line where Marta is fighting. The last we heard before this was that she just picked up the pitchfork. But how is she tired already? As a reader, I also wonder how well she's able to fight. Considering her old age. And aren't the people of the village supposed to be farmers, not fighters? There's an introduction of an old iron key, a magical key, and there's a hint at the old history of this family, of this place. So I would also add some genuine reader questions in the document. So I wonder if they resettled after burying this magic. I wonder how much the descendants know about this magic. Really like this paragraph. I think it really provides a very ominous imagery. I would be scared if I were them and saw this figure. And it also sets a very nice tone for the story, for this genre. I was also a bit confused here. So a sound that vibrated in her teeth. So who is her? I actually think it's Marta, but yeah, but maybe for this part, instead of her, we can just go ahead and just say Marta, right? Okay, so for this part, it kind of felt like something was missing. So there's a pressure and a subtle resistance that was strong enough to push back this malevolent force that was already overpowering them. So for this part, I would say consider adding a line where Marta is confused or questioning if the subtle resistance was real or imagined. These are essentially polar opposites, right? A subtle resistance that was seemingly powerful enough to push back against this very, very strong force. And I feel like with this line here, I think it's a very good detail, but with the way it's written, I think that it was kind of glossed over. It's just the short paragraph of something subtle, and then the rest was about something very intense, something very strong. So I think that with the idea that I get from this sentence, it might benefit if this part was highlighted by adding a line about Martha questioning if it was real or imagined or something similar. But of course, this is just a suggestion and everything will be up to the author since they know their work best. Okay, and then we have this part here. The grandfather who owns the old iron key that was passed on to Martha. Upon reading, upon reading, Grandfather, what did you leave us? It felt sure to me as the reader that the old key was very powerful and that its powers were already significantly revealed. I had to reread the first highlighted sentence to check if I missed something big that happened with the magic key. So we'll be switching character POVs essentially now, and then a different location. And if you check out the synopsis of the story, and if you question why the thumbnail features a knight, I did mention in my previous videos that this epic tale stars a giantess and a cynical knight. They're actually not yet mentioned in this chapter. And I did tell the author that I was wondering where they were, and they did say that they would probably rename this chapter into the prologue or chapter 0 instead, since they are not yet featured in this part. Okay, so when I first read this, Elenia Ran, I forgot who Elenia was, but judging how the story now focuses on her until the very end of the chapter, she must be important, right? She is the one who has been tasked by Martha to run to Lastwall for aid and to tell them that the old stories are true. Very intriguing. I like the way the tone is set in the writing. It very perfectly fits the genre of dark fantasy. Okay, let's continue. First comment about Elenia. So much was happening that I forgot who she was. So I had to look for her first appearance earlier in the chapter. And whenever a character is introduced, especially an important one, it's very important to be able to make a good first impression, because it's essentially the first time that the reader is going to be meeting them, and like how they would meet any old person in real life, a lasting impression is, gonna give them insight if this is a person they would like, a person they would care about, and if we're gonna be reading from their head in specific chunks of the text, it's important to be able to establish why the reader should be interested in what happens to them in the story. Also, consider adding a line about her running to Lastwall and why as a sort of recap. Okay. And Elenia is also clearly an important character since we follow her to the end of the first chapter. Consider adding a memorable detail about her when she is first introduced. Okay, so for this part, consider mentioning the mother first, because earlier on, in order, it was said, "They're counting on me, mother, father, little Tim." So consider mentioning the paragraph with her mother before her father, since she was mentioned first earlier. When I read this part, it also made me wonder where her family was when the chaos started. Especially little Tim, because it sounds like he's very, very young in age still. I like the use of souls here. So this might be a prologue or chapter 0, nevertheless it's the first chapter. It's also very important that it ends with a hook that makes the reader want to continue to the next chapter, to the next part of the story. And I would say that the ending here provides an interesting final image before the close of the first chapter. And I would continue reading. I think it's very interesting. I like the world building with the old magic key. I'm interested how it's going to play a part here, especially with Marta's family history. And even though I dove into the story wanting to read about a giantess and a knight and didn't read them here, this chapter in and of itself was already very interesting. It sets the tone of the story nicely and it has some nice world building, and it actually makes me want to finally get to meet our hero and heroine and know more about them as they go on to this quest. So this is going to have forbidden magic and found family, and if you guys want to read more about it, the author's story is linked in the description box below, and all of their information too. And if you guys watched until the very end of the video, I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and next week I'll be doing a line and copy edit of the same chapter. So until next week, see you guys next time.